Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming to this first session this afternoon, the final quarter of Giant Health 2021. Great to have you back. And we have three items this afternoon. Firstly, two presentations from our friends at McKinsey, and they'll be pre-recorded sessions, so we'll be able to see those online and in this auditorium now. And then we'll be doing a panel discussion at about 3:30, where I'll be bringing some fantastic speakers together, Zeke being one of them, who's in the audience here now, and we'll be discussing age-related tech. So without further ado, I will jump to the beginning of this session, just introduce Thrive and what we do. We're looking after this session today. So we are a team specializing in the development of wearable technology, and we specifically have a mission to work on technologies that have disruptive impact in the health and wellness space. So we look to work with teams across three sort of major dimensions. I'll just jump forward to that. So physical device development, and then we work on interfaces and the digital side of things, creating ways of looking at that information. And to tie it all together, we do some data science specifically in relation to creating algorithms on wearable technology in order to pre-process and pre-filter that data that's coming from the wearable devices. So we bring this proposition together to work with either startups, scale-ups, VC-backed teams working in wearables, wanting to be in wearable technology. Or we also work with sort of larger SMEs wanting to break into wearable tech or create health tech innovations and products. And we work as a sort of technical team to support those activities. We have a fairly, I won't go into the case studies right now, sorry. We have a fairly extensive geographical footprint. So we work all over the place, lots of different companies, and more than happy to talk to anyone at this event who's looking to get into wearables or take a wearable to market. My team are situated. Further ado, I'm going to introduce our first session of this afternoon, and this is a keynote address entitled Generating Real-World Evidence at Scale Using Advanced Analytics, and this is a presentation by Chris Anagnostopoulos from McKinsey & Company. If you could roll the video, gents. Thank you very much.
For me too, it's a delight to be here and a great honor. I'm Chris. I'm a senior expert at McKinsey. I'm focused on the safe adoption of artificial intelligence and machine learning in the life sciences, and in particular, evidence generation by the fusion of real-world data with other sources of evidence. My background is in large part academic, having been an associate professor at Imperial College, and I bring in a statistical mindset to my work, thinking a lot about what needs to be in place in terms of guardrails to ensure that insights extracted from machine learning models are reliable and actionable.
So we're very excited to talk today about the topic of next generation real-world evidence analytics. And today we wanted to cover three topics. First of all, what do we mean when we say next generation real-world evidence, and what actually value does that create for life sciences companies? The second is, how does one know when it makes sense to leverage next generation real-world evidence? And how do you industrialize this? How do you do this and capture value from it at scale? And before we dive into what we mean by next generation real-world evidence, it's worth potentially taking a step back and looking at the trends that we all acknowledge are happening that are driving really strong interest in real-world evidence over the last kind of several years. And much of what's on the slide could have been said several years ago. The trends driving use and acceptance of evidence beyond clinical trials are well known and have been in place for a while in terms of acceptance from various regulatory bodies, healthcare professionals and healthcare stakeholder acceptance and demand for data beyond clinical trials, and the growth in data that can be leveraged and analytical methods that can be deployed while outcomes, patient centricity, and value-based care. I think what's different and what's exciting is that we're beginning to see industry players in life sciences capture really transformative value from this, from indication finding to regulatory approval support to value creation for on-market assets. There are now more and more tangible examples of how real-world evidence can create value. And we see that pharma companies, for the most part, are capturing this value at scale. We see a lot in oncology and rare disease, label approvals, and some really transformative examples in other therapeutic areas as well. And What we get excited about also is that the blueprint for success, what it takes to capture this value, is becoming clearer and clearer, from the strategy that's required to the organization to the capabilities and the underlying tools. And we see that a very large proportion of companies, 80%, have established evidence-wide, enterprise-wide integrated evidence generation planning to allow them to do this across the entire value chain. And some examples, we see that if we look across life sciences, pharma companies have traditionally been the tip of the spear, as it were, in capturing value from real-world evidence, and it's slightly less tapped into in other areas like diagnostics and medtech. But we see in R&D, from using novel endpoints in clinical trial, from using omics data to identify variants, this can have a significant impact in terms of the pace and the rigor at which people are able to identify new indications for products and inform trial design. We see that in market access, there's significant reimbursement support that can come from real-world evidence. We see a lot of potential for health economic impact, and even in medtech here, some indication expansion outside of clinical trials. And then in the post-commercialization stages, see that enabling evidence to be published that can inform decision-making, to demonstrate improved outcomes in particular therapies, and to identify a broader range of patients who might benefit from the adequate therapy, and to address evidence gaps for an asset at much greater pace and reduce cost. And this is in part enabled, as I alluded to, by burgeoning in the sources of data that are available. And on this chart, we talk a bit about data richness and completeness, of which the clinical trial obviously is the classical go-to. But when looking at real-world data sources, labs, claims, EMR, they have significantly more breadth in terms of what could be tapped into. And when we talk about other less conventionally used sources like unstructured imaging data, transcriptomics, proteomics, social media data, and doctors' notes, there's a treasure trove in there, but it's difficult to get at. And on the chart, what we call this data engineering effort is a reflection of how clean is that data, how much work does it need to extract those insights. And in a sense, that's a trade-off that we're seeing is very real in terms of working with the real-world data to get access to that breadth, often requires significant uptick in the analytical methods that are deployed. And Chris will talk a little bit about what those methods are.
Thank you very much, Alex. I think it's always difficult to classify analytical methods into sort of mutually exclusive groups, but we're making an attempt here to think of them as falling in one of three categories. In descriptive statistics, the purpose is primarily to just explore the data, identify interesting patterns, without necessarily building in any assumptions or trying to test any assumptions, and certainly not trying to predict what happens out of the training sample. In contrast, in classical statistics, and by the term classical here, we mean established methods for statistical analysis of medical and life sciences data, the main objective is explanatory. So there is either an existing hypothesis to be tested, or perhaps there's an intention to test which hypothesis is the most likely among several. At the end of the spectrum, we have advanced analytics, where primarily the technique is designed to predict, to have very high predictive accuracy out of samples. So the main focus is generalizability, and at the same time, by utilizing modern compute and novel algorithms, it can actually absorb and ingest vast amounts of data that classical methods or descriptive stats couldn't possibly scale to. So with that distinction in mind, we can then go through a number of different axes and see what is the current, if you like, standard in the industry along each of those dimensions with respect to that distinction, and where could we get to in the future. Starting with data, in general, descriptive statistics offer very targeted analysis of just the very high-level main features of the population of interest, like the outcome or the basic demographics. With classical statistics, we can get to an investigation of a limited set of variables, like, for example, basic phenotypes or basic demographics, and try to understand how these predict or relate with the outcome of interest. So the choice of variables to focus on is very much driven by medical expertise there. In advanced analytics, instead, the algorithms and the compute is set up in a way that can ingest thousands of variables from structured or even unstructured data increasingly. We see the industry positioned quite squarely in the classical statistics, if you like, comfort zone when it comes to the amounts of data that are ingested on a day-to-day basis in this space. When it comes to accuracy and bias control, descriptive statistics is not designed to offer either of those, and therefore it's kind of out of scope. But in classical statistics, bias reduction is a very core consideration, and there is very long established techniques for reducing bias, either through population refinement or matching. However, generally speaking, there is an over-reliance on linearity and other simplifying assumptions, and these are sort of traditionally coming from computational restrictions that are no longer in place. So we could see a path towards techniques that achieve bias control via increased reliance on nonlinear, very flexible methods that might be computationally intensive, but it's an amount of computation that we can now easily handle. So that's an ongoing journey along that dimension. An important consideration is causality. So obviously causality is the holy grail, not just in the life sciences, but in any scientific discipline. And without randomization, so in the absence of randomized clinical trial, there are certain techniques that we can use to get us closer to causal inference, but they're very challenging and they need to be employed with care. And therefore, the industry is currently relatively cautious when it comes to attempting to do causal inference on data that is not perfectly randomized in a double-blind setting. At the same time, very persistent correlations after correcting for certain propensity to treat or other types of bias and selection mechanism correction, they can appear as hypotheses that can then be further validated in future experiments. When it comes to advanced analytics in causal inference, there's a flurry of interest right now in combining techniques from machine learning with biostatistical methods for estimating outcomes and effects to achieve a causal inference framework that is much more generic. For example, using conditional independence assumptions in probabilistic graph models across hundreds of variables. So that, again, is an evolving space, but one that is still seeing a growing but modest adoption in the industry. When it comes to insight generation, it's pretty clear that it's tied to the amount of data that can be ingested to a large extent. Descriptive statistics is largely manual, whereas in classical statistics, we can have confirmation or even validation under certain conditions of largely pre-existing hypotheses, whereas in contrast, with advanced analytics, we can get to automated discovery of insights from very large sets of variables. Again, the industry is positioned in the neighborhood of the classical methodology in that regard. And finally, industrialization is linked to the above point as well. The extent to which you can repeat an analysis, refresh it with new data, or extend it to similar use cases is a main driver of the speed of insight generation. And there, although we've seen widespread industrialization of business intelligence dashboards and basic descriptive stats, most classical analysis remain one-off exercises, and that's primarily because of the reliance on manual steps. Whereas with advanced analytics, we see an attempt and a tendency, which is often successful, to industrialize both the data engineering and the modeling pipelines so that they can be automatically refreshed with new data and achieve production of insights at scale. And again, that's a journey that's ongoing, and that we're at the very beginning of that journey in the industry. So with that in mind, I wanted to go to the next page, which is taking a slightly different perspective on largely the same question. It's important to recognize that real-world data have certain shortcomings that aren't present in, say, RCTs, but they also have benefits over data sets that are available in RCTs. And increasingly, we see that with advanced analytics and sophisticated statistical methodology, we can overcome or mitigate some of these risks. That's a very exciting development because real-world data capture an aspect of patient journeys and certain patient populations that are very hard to observe otherwise. So it's a very important objective for patient outcomes. So some of these risks include, for example, treatment assignment or other selection biases. The decision to treat a patient with a certain treatment is not randomized in the real world, so therefore that has to be accounted for. And there are rapid advances, as I mentioned already before, in causal inference with machine learning methods, with advanced analytics, to correct for that bias, or at least diagnose it when it's there and make it transparent. At the same time, we see an increased pragmatism in clinical trials. So in a sense, there are situations where prospective observational trials are approximating real-world data, and we can learn from either setting and sort of borrow strength across the two. Data engineering has traditionally been a barrier to the adoption of real-world evidence generation techniques, but increasingly the big data toolbox has been standardized, even commoditized, one would say. It's scale, it's easy to adopt now in a large enterprise, And increasingly, data vendors are also conforming to standards when it comes to data models and so on. And therefore, there's a set of best practices that are arising in the space, which is making data engineering easier. At the same time, the revolution of deep learning and end-to-end deep learning, this idea of rather than having to generate each feature that describes a patient one by one, relying on a deep learning model to discover it by itself, which is often referred to as representation learning, that's also picking up speed in this space. And that's particularly helpful with semi-structured or unstructured data. A couple of other points I wanted to make include the lack of availability of appropriate endpoints. The endpoint that you can design to observe in a clinical trial might not be exactly available in a real-world setting. So instead, we can rely on proxies using combination of other information, or increasingly digital health markers that are only available in real-world settings and now are being validated, of course, through more formal setups. And these are gradually producing high-quality sensors that can give us a view of a patient journey and patient outcomes over very long-term horizons, which is fairly unique and important. When it comes to data quality, increasingly we have both tools and best practices that arise specifically for real-world data to ensure that there's high data quality and that any issues are automatically flagged. And automation is very important when it comes to quality in general. It's important to have a pipeline that is robust to data quality issues, and these are not discovered post hoc after the fact, but in fact flagged automatically by the pipeline. Similarly, for heterogeneity of cohorts, it's often the case that real-world data has in principle a very diverse population of patients, but in order to identify it, that can require fairly advanced engineering. Thankfully, that's coming into place. And modern advanced analytics techniques, especially non-parametric techniques that are very flexible, are able to capture more heterogeneity than classical methods under the right conditions. And finally, a smaller point, increasingly regulatory agencies are also leading the way, providing very clear guidance on the use of real-world evidence, and we're generating a big sort of growing literature is being generated on the use of, for example, synthetic control arms that we can learn from also in real-world evidence studies that do not involve necessarily a regulatory component. So with that, I'm going to pass back on to Alex to take us through the next part of the presentation.
Thanks, Chris. And what we see is that this increase in data breadth and richness, the analytical approaches, the change in how the industry is thinking about it, is actually opening up the aperture in terms of where in the value chain real-world evidence can create value. And what we see is that although classically real-world data would have been used for natural history studies, feasibility, safety monitoring, that kind of thing, we see that in research and development, there is significant utility and value creation from real-world evidence in terms of using that data to provide deeper understanding on biological pathways themselves in terms of understanding disease progression, drivers of response, prioritization of indications, leveraging not just real-world data, but also a broad range of images, omics, clinical trial data, to really get as close as possible to linking biology to outcomes. And that also comes with a view of getting a much more granular picture of unmet need and understanding patient unmet need in the real world. We also see that being applied a lot to optimizing clinical trial design, leveraging the different data sets that I mentioned to get a more precise view on inclusion and exclusion criteria, endpoint selection, those kind of things. And also automatic monitoring of real-world outcomes just to inform ongoing R&D programs. There's, of course, applicability in market access in terms of demonstration of economic value, but also understanding of disease burden, particularly understanding patients who are perhaps particularly high burden disease before a product is launched. Medical, of course, is an area where real-world evidence has been used for many years in pharmacovigilance, and that continues to be the case. We see a lot of that happening at scale with benefit risk analysis happening in a much more at scale automated way. We see a lot of applicability for evidence of head-to-head differentiation, identifying subpopulations who benefit from specific therapies, and of course, improving the effectiveness and precision with which medical affairs act with a better understanding of the real-world treatment and unmet need. And then from a commercialization perspective, of course, the real-world data can inform strategic and tactical decisions based on understanding of patients that use the therapy, drivers of switch, adherence, discontinuation, and in some cases, even informing decisions at point of care with clinical decision support systems based on identifying patients who might be undiagnosed, patients who might be at high risk, for example. And with that, what we wanted to do is show quickly one example of a use case for looking at head-to-head comparisons. And what you see here is a sanitized output from this use case, just as an illustration. And the bubble chart is the aggregation of data from a patient-level predictive model. I won't go into the details, but it's effectively a model that we ran on a large electronic medical record and claims linked data set. And that model uses some of the methods that Chris described to effectively look at hundreds of thousands of patients, each of these patients having 5 or so years of longitudinal data and hundreds of different disease characteristics, some of which you see on the right-hand side, spreading from demographics, comorbidities, co-prescriptions, disease severity, biomarkers. And the models are able to look at these patients and predict what their outcomes would be on different therapies, controlling for these confounders. And so understanding what would happen to these patients if they switch from therapy B to therapy A, with all else remaining constant. The bubble chart is the aggregation of that model into a subpopulation level view. And so what we have here is on the X and Y axis, we're looking at the difference of a subpopulation between the average patients. We have here in the middle of the all patients bubble. And you can see the size of the other bubbles represents the size of the subpopulation. So if we pick an example, this is patients with a BMI between 32 and 34. The position on the x-axis tells us that any subpopulation to the right of the x-axis has a lower event rate. They have improved clinical outcomes because the therapy is ameliorating has reduced in frequency. So we see that this subpopulation is having better outcomes on therapy A than the average patient on therapy A. We also see as on the y-axis the differential response between therapy A and therapy B. And again, subpopulations above the 0 line have improved outcomes on therapy A compared to therapy B as predicted by the model. And what we're able to do then is double click on a given subpopulation. So this is the model predicting that patients with BMI between 31.8 and 34 will have an 18% improvement in their clinical outcomes if they were to switch from therapy B to therapy A. And because it's linked claims and electronic medical record data, we can also look at the cost of those events and therefore the cost saving to the system by that switch. You can imagine that this has broad applicability in a number of situations. This has been used for hypothesis generation for subsequent publication, for informing discussions with healthcare stakeholders, regulators, and payers, for informing R&D discussions based on a more granular understanding of response and drivers of response, and informing franchise strategy and tactics. And increasingly what we see, to Chris's point about industrialization, is moving away from this view, which is therapy A versus therapy B on one endpoint, to a more therapeutic area, disease area wide perspective. So you can imagine that these models could be constructed at a much greater scale, looking at not just therapy A compared to therapy B, but looking at A compared to C, A compared to no therapy at all, B compared to C, and looking at a number of endpoints. So not just acute endpoints, but also healthcare resource utilization, more disease progression, and kind of survival endpoints. And you can imagine that that breadth of insight generated at that pace is obviously opens up a whole world of possibilities in terms of how these insights can be used. And this is exactly what we see is leveraging the underlying analytical approaches that allow for industrialized at-scale evidence generation to create a new enterprise-wide approach to doing this, whereby you can see in the middle of the screen, all of the relevant data sets are pulled into one place, the clinical trial, the claims, the omics, the literature, and analytical models are constructed on top in a very scalable, industrialized, reusable way. So for questions that are commonly asked, for example, comparison versus another molecule, understanding of drivers of switch, understanding of disease progression drivers, those can be built in a way that is very flexible, reusable, and scalable to different therapeutic areas and assets. This center can then obviously answer questions that are part of the integrated evidence generation plan. It can help to close those gaps. It can also inform the formation of these plans with more granular insight of what's happening in the real world to better understand how the strategy should be put together. And then on the right-hand side, you can see that obviously these insights are then disseminated to external stakeholders in terms of patients, healthcare professionals, regulators, payers, and also internal stakeholders, like I mentioned, in terms of informing R&D, in terms of informing strategy, and of course, medical evidence generation. So this is a very appealing vision, but what does it take for a life sciences company to get here? There are broadly 8 dimensions that are necessary. And starting from the top, it's critical to have a strategy that is very specific, linked to the value that you aspire to create in various therapeutic areas and areas of the value chain, time-bound, and critically it has top-down sponsorship. You know, we see leading companies don't just have a vision that is about aspiring to have a leadership position, but doing so to create a specific kind of value in a specific area. Then creating that value requires bringing together cross-functional teams to deliver on these critical use cases at pace, and not just to deliver the analytics, but then to operationalize it, to disseminate it, not just through rapid publications, but also through digital mechanisms of dissemination, and tracking the impact from this work is also critical and difficult. The establishing an organization that can have true integrated evidence generation across the value chain, getting the use of real-world evidence in early enough into the discussion and not having it as an afterthought, and integrating the needs across different geographies is extremely difficult. Chris will talk more about the capabilities, the breadth of different skill sets, and the culture that's required in terms of confidence and a deliberate perspective on when to use different methodologies. And of course, this can't be done in a kind of vacuum. This requires partnerships with the outside world, with analytics players, with healthcare stakeholders, with data companies, and it requires building platforms internally that allow for this evidence generation at scale, in terms of lab environments to develop models and factory environments to industrialize them. And what we see is that although some companies have strong positions on these dimensions, there are no companies who have a leadership position across the board. And most companies have a very specific strategic posture on where they want to have leadership. And getting that leadership can take multiple years. And those leadership positions are fragile. It's not the case that once leadership is achieved, people can rest on their laurels. It's a continuous innovation cycle to remain at the leading forefront of the industry. Given how important capabilities and culture are, particularly to the application of advanced analytics in real-world evidence, we wanted to double-click on that, which Chris can do now.
Thank you. What we see on the page is 3 main categories of skill set that is required to successfully deliver real-world evidence transformations, and 2 of them won't be surprising to anyone. So obviously, one needs a team of highly trained data scientists and data engineers with specific skill set in big data analysis and other tools that are required for real-world data. Additionally, of course, it's critical to have clinical input. That is sometimes underestimated by the data science teams, and it's important to have clinical input throughout the model lifecycle. So understanding how to define the cohort, how to choose the right target variable, often a proxy or a surrogate endpoint will have to be used. That's a very sensitive and important clinical decision. So having the oversight of a domain expert, ideally at all times, is the best way to achieve a safe outcome. At the same time, though, there's a 3rd type of capability that is critical for success, which we refer to as a translator on this page. Now, the translator is effectively the person who can translate business needs into advanced analytics and make the right priority calls when it comes to deciding the benefits, upsides, downsides of specific questions and respective approaches. So a translator is not a data scientist or a data engineer. They would have very specific experience working with analytics, especially at least in one specific domain. And they would be very experienced in managing projects, understanding complexity, risk management, and so on. But they're a very critical role in gelling together that team of diverse expertise. And it's also an incredibly rewarding role. So the translators that we've seen are most effective are themselves extremely passionate about the adoption of data science in the life sciences, and they have a vision as to how that needs to be done. And therefore, they're critical in helping translate that ambition from the data science to the clinical teams and vice versa. So acting as a bridge between those 2 communities. The dedication of that particular role is quite important as well. We see that organizations that have dedicated translators that commit close to full time on projects that they're actively managing, or at least in that capacity, if they're managing multiple projects, is amenable to success in this space. And the way in which these groups of experts work is often in the same room or in the same call, but primarily also iteratively. So the agile process, which has proven itself beyond doubt in the software engineering world, is also a best practice here through agile sprints, where these give the opportunity to take a step back, understand the progress, revise any decisions that have led down blind paths, and so on. So this approach enables the teams to test basically both the approach and the decisions made very early, and be agile in revising any decisions that need to be revised. And information upstream is, of course, flowing at a regular pace in an agile workstream. It's not like a project is signed off and then nobody hears from them for months, but instead, on a regular basis, every 2-3 weeks, there's a constant flow of information, getting feedback from leadership about the progress of the project. I wanted now to double click for a moment on the data science bucket, if you like, and make a point that is often lost, which is that we are in the life sciences unique in that there's already a culture of data science, a very strong culture of data science present in the life sciences with an extremely successful pedigree. I mean, it's no exaggeration to say that the doubly blind randomized clinical trial is probably the biggest success story, if you like, of statistical methodology. Very early on in the development of the what we call the data science or machine learning or advanced analytics community, it was identified that there's these two different cultures, who here we refer to as the biostatisticians and the AAML practitioners, and they have different objectives by default. Biostatistician by default is focused on explanation, explanatory modeling, causal modeling where possible. So when they're looking at a real-world data set, their perspective is, can I recreate as much as possible the conditions that would hold in an RCT so that I can make sure that the results are valid? At the same time, the data scientist or ML practitioner would instead be focused on prediction. How can I define a future data set or hold out some data and test the accuracy of my methods in a data-driven way rather than try to constrain them a priori to a specific approach? And these two perspectives are both valid, and we've now seen the tremendous success that the predictive mindset also has to offer in the form of deep learning successes and successes in machine learning across multiple industries. Therefore, in order to achieve the biggest impact, it is important to have a very clear way for biostatisticians to work hand in hand with data scientists and ML practitioners. One framework to have in mind is that biostatisticians are in fact responsible for the veracity of individual findings, whereas data scientists and ML practitioners are best placed to hold the bar for predictive accuracy and out-of-sample generalization. And these two are actually two different risk mindsets. Both communities have their own risk management processes. Data scientists will focus on avoiding overfitting. Biostatisticians will focus on the appropriateness of the conditions and any selection mechanisms. And in combination, they form a formidable team to achieve insight generation from data as complex as real-world data. So to conclude, in order to generate maximum impact here, there needs to be a use case by use case consideration of how to mix these two skill sets together, understand the remits, and make sure that the priority is placed on whichever objective is appropriate for the use case at hand. Is it primarily prediction? Is it primarily explanation? Is it a mix of both? It has to be a use case by use case consideration. So this is, I guess, our closing remark, and it's, I think, appropriate to end on a point of culture, because in the end, what we see is that leadership generates culture, and then culture is the momentum that persists in the longer term. So with that, I wanted to thank you all for having us again. And Alex, I don't know if you also want to say a word of goodbye.
Yeah, I wanted to echo Chris's thanks for having us, and hope that was informative, and looking forward to the questions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all for having us. Welcome to this session on Giant Health 2021 and real world evidence, the fireside chat. So briefly by introduction, I'm Alex de Veersen. I'm a partner with McKinsey & Company based in London. I lead globally a lot of our work in advanced analytics in life sciences, and I globally co-lead our work in evidence generation and real world evidence analytics. And today my colleague Chris and I are going to talk to Brandon Allgood. Chris, maybe you introduce yourself and then we can introduce Brandon.
Sure, thanks, Alex, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'm a senior expert at McKinsey Quantum Black, where I focus on evidence generation and R&D using data science and AI in the life sciences. My background is primarily academic. I was an associate professor at Imperial College in the statistics section, and I'm very interested in the fusion of statistical methods with AI. It is my real pleasure to also introduce Brandon Allgood, the Chief AI Officer at Tallo, and a co-founder and CDO at Numerate previously. He's also the co-founder and chair of the Alliance of AI in Healthcare. Brandon, welcome.
Thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
Excellent. Brandon, maybe we start with one of the broader questions when we think about trends. How do you see the real-world data ecosystem balancing the need for the linked patient-level granular data that's essential to enable some of the analytics use cases we'll speak about, with the importance of the fundamental importance of patient privacy?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I think right now the ecosystem, as it should be, is really leaning more towards privacy and making sure that patients' data are being protected, that patients' privacy are being protected. This is through various mechanisms such as IRBs and isolating data, really making sure that data is being aggregated properly and that there's no re-identification, even by accident re-identification of patients. And I think this is the right way to go. I do think, however, we need to be leaning towards, while we need to continue that good work around privacy, fair principles in terms of fair data is something that has not quite fully made its penetration into real world data, and I think it needs to. And that's one of the things that I would say is kind of holding us back and really kind of preventing us from moving forward while protecting those that patient privacy. Another kind of issue that exists in particular in the United States is the fragmentation. I can tell you right now, as someone that obviously pays a lot of close attention to that and someone with a chronic disease, my data is at least in 6, if not probably more, different systems, and I don't think any single healthcare provider or organization would be able to see the entirety of my disease. I aggregate it and give it to all of them, but if I didn't do that personally, they would not have that, and it would be really hard to understand the progression of my disease.
So that's really interesting to note, and in particular with regards to FAIR principles, it's interesting how a concept that took hold in the research ecosystem is now actually proving useful also in the healthcare system at large, which is an operational system. It's often collecting data primarily for administrative reasons or operational reasons, and therefore perhaps wasn't designed in its entirety with FAIR principles in mind. What's your take with regards to the degree to which FAIR principles are already in place and actionable in the research data ecosystem as opposed to real world data? Is that gap still present, or are we observing the same level of fragmentation also in the research data ecosystem?
So in research data, we are doing better, obviously. So in research data, you often involve data engineers at an earlier stage, planning for the capture, planning for the storage, planning for the explorability. So I think while we're not there completely today yet, but on the research side, there's certainly more thought that goes into it early on, given the individuals that tend to be involved in those efforts.
That's right.
And that's obviously one piece of the puzzle, but there are many different healthcare stakeholders involved in the kind of real-world evidence ecosystem, and we talk a lot about how their perceptions with regards to real-world evidence, and particularly with novel analytical methods for real-world evidence, are changing. From your position in the industry, how quickly do you see that moving, and what are the potential challenges to that moving in that direction?
Yeah, so I think the speed in which that moves actually depends on us. right? We need to, it's incumbent upon those of us that are consuming those data and producing insights to show the benefit while simultaneously protecting the privacy. I think it's a building of trust, and showing these healthcare providers and other stakeholders that there's a lot of value. And so, there's certainly a fear of AI, because AI is, again, is seen as something that's a black box, that's a mystery that could potentially do harm, and people worry about loss of privacy. But I think we need to show them what's possible and show them that we can protect it. I think also what they need to see to build trust is diversity. Diversity among data scientists, among those people working with the data, diversity in terms of the types of data we're collecting, not just in the kind of major centers like Cambridge and San Francisco, and these other places where, at least within the United States, those are the predominant sources of data that we actually go in, partner with organizations, with communities that are underrepresented, and make sure that those data get in. So I think there's a number of different things that we need to be doing as a collective ecosystem to further bolster that trust.
I think that's right. And it's interesting that it's coinciding with a more general movement in AI and data science in general, recognizing the need to sort of self-regulate almost as a community and understand what it means to produce reliable, trustworthy, and ethical AI. And some of the best practices that are arising out of that, like, for example, detecting bias, measuring diversity, understanding the fairness profile, but also taking challenges such as selection mechanisms more seriously and in a more head-on fashion. I think this risk mindset in general that the AI community is adopting is actually going to be very helpful in this particular domain. And it seems to me that AI in the life sciences might actually end up being perhaps a slow adopter at first, but eventually a thought leader in how much care we need to take, additional care, to ensure that AI methods prove the benefit, but also protect against possible risk of harm in the ways you just mentioned, Brandon. It's an exciting space, and with real-world data, the selection mechanisms that are in place are increasingly becoming known, and we're studying them and understanding them, and therefore we're one step closer to mitigate from that.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think the fact that I agree with you, we will, as an industry, be the leaders because of just the base of privacy, of concern for privacy, making sure that we are taking the best care of patients, where in places like the internet, social media, that's not where there's not that base. They have to kind of retrofit in many ways that concern and that thought process.
With that, I think will be a very high bar on the industry to know when to deploy which methods, when they're appropriate, when they're suitable, when they can actually kind of add value over other methods. To that end, I mean, we speak a lot about the potential for more advanced approaches in real-world evidence to bring value in R&D, in medical, and safety, whatever it might be. Where do you see the most potential impact from deploying these new methods? Again, notwithstanding everything we discussed, assuming it can be done in kind of an appropriate way.
Yeah, I think the primary place, the place I've been most excited about for quite a while, is in pharmacovigilance, is in post-market analytics, making sure that the drug products and the therapies that we're putting out there are truly safe and efficacious. And the fact that now with the movement of IoT, where everyone's wearing a device of some sort, so we're collecting more and more data on individuals, which means more and more data has to be streamed back to the companies that own these, or that are administrating and own these products. And so they need to sift through more and more of that data. And I think at this point, machine learning analytics on that real world data is important, because we are just not, human analytics is not going to scale exponentially while the data that we're generating is scaling exponentially. So I think pharmacovigilance is one of those places where it's not a luxury; it's absolutely required that we deploy machine learning in order to keep up with and make sure that we are protecting, like I said, the efficacy, making sure we're ensuring efficacy and protecting the safety of individuals. I think following pharmacovigilance, I think we're going to see a lot more work in the R&D space, like the work that Chris is doing in applying analytics to real world data, bringing together various data sets, bringing together not just real world data, but combining real world data with data sets that I would say not everyone's really thinking about bringing together: biological data sets, chemistry data sets, combining them together using data fusion techniques that we're still working on and innovating around to build a bigger picture, a broader picture of not just patients and disease journeys, but really understanding fundamental biology. I think you're also the other area you're going to see this in is in the medical side, as we start to see more companies doing telemedicine. I think with one of the interesting things about what COVID did for us and forcing us all to sit at home for that last year and a half is we've seen a very large investment in telemedicine, in handing doctors more tools, providing them more analytics, so that they don't necessarily have to rely on that face-to-face meeting, that they can actually collect data using devices we already have in our homes, having telemedicine integration. I think there's a lot of things that are we're already seeing coming out of the medical side, and we'll see more of that in the future. We're going to be going to the doctor, I think, less, but collecting more data for them to look at and analyze.
And Brandon, probably if I take away anything from your answer, it's not an or, it's an and, right? It's not that we're going to see this being deployed in one part of the pharma value chain. It's going to probably be essential in many areas, to your point.
Right. Yeah, and I think where it's likely going to be slower, for good reason, is going to be in the clinical side, where we have regulations and we need to make sure that we're protecting patients, making sure that the models we're developing are fair, unbiased, and so I think they're just due to the nature of the clinical side, it's going to be a bit slower. But I think it's actually that's where I get the most excited, and that's where my hope is that we start making more, that we build partnerships with regulators, and that we really move the system forward, because I think that's where the biggest potential benefit comes from. And obviously, if you get something approved and you work with regulators in the clinic, that then rolls into the market as well and becomes a medical tool.
I think that's sort of a very interesting question I wanted to pause on for a moment. When we talk about data fusion across different types of data, but at the same time wondering about how different use cases are enabled by real-world evidence, the fusion of real-world data with clinical trials in particular seems a very exciting space. And there can be novel bridges to that, like you mentioned, for example, digital wearables becoming endpoints perhaps in the future that are then shared reliably across both sources of evidence. But perhaps there are other ways in which you see those two sources being used together.
Yeah, so again, another thing I'm excited about is kind of the advent of, or the broader use of pragmatic clinical trials. So being able to go into a healthcare system that is more integrated, and actually selecting patients out of that healthcare system to enroll in a clinical trial, run the clinical trial, and then continue to follow them in the healthcare system post-clinical trial. I think this idea of being able to really understand and capture the patient journey up to the clinical trial and post-clinical trial is going to give us a lot of deeper insights into the disease progression, into the diagnostics, into the types of interventions that we have. So very excited about that. I also, again, clinical trials, most clinical trials today, you collect only the data you need, right? And again, the clinical trials are run in a way very similar to what Alex was talking about, in that they're collecting data not necessarily for insights and analytics, but to answer a very particular question, right? And I think if we go into if we start to think about clinical trials in a different way, as not just collecting data to answer that one question, the one question that the clinical trial is attempting to answer, but to see it as an opportunity to monitor disease, to monitor patients, to contribute a broader understanding of that disease through the use of that data. I think some companies are starting to think about that. We are definitely thinking about that and moving in that direction at Ballo. And so I think that's another thing, that will help us kind of bridge the RCT to the RWE bridge, because then you start to actually collect more data that you can connect.
That's exactly right. I think that thinking about the methodologies themselves now for a moment, like we've talked a lot about how bringing the best of AI and ML, machine learning, and statistical methodology, of course, to bear on this problem can unlock a lot of value. But what do you see, if anything, in specific as the next frontier of innovation in the analytical approaches that are used for real-world evidence, if we're going to get technical for a moment? And how do you think companies should prepare for that?
Yeah, this is a big question. I think innovation that's happening right now in causal inference, the kind of work again that you work on, Chris, are the places where I'm very excited about bringing in insights, being able to make the kinds of models that we build more explainable, more interpretable, kind of merging those. But again, like we talked about, the data fusion ideas, being able to develop methods to bring in all sorts of different types of data, combine data from different systems, and even combine data, not necessarily about being able to use tokenization and combine data on an individual patient level, but to be able to identify the same sub-patient populations in two different systems, and then being able to fuse those, which that also in an interesting way avoids some of the privacy concerns, because you definitely know that there are two different sets of individuals, but you've identified them well enough that you know that you have that distribution of disease state and other variables that you can use to combine them. And I think, in terms of companies getting ready for this, we as an industry are no different in this way than others, in that the number of people in the world with the skill sets to both understand the chemistry, the biology, the epidemiology, the various aspects of an already pretty complex industry, and then combine that with an understanding of statistics and machine learning. I think it's just right now it's a matter of being able to train those individuals, being able to find those individuals. So I think one of the things that companies can do is internally begin to develop cross training programs. At Ballo, we I would say talk almost on a daily basis about how we start to develop bilingual leaders. Bilingual being 1 foot in the medical side and the biology side, and 1 foot in in the machine learning side, and you can see them. We have some that are titrating from the machine learning side over to the medical side, and some that are kind of titrating over from the medical side into the machine learning side. So I think we need to, at a university level, be training more individuals in kind of skill sets like statistics and machine learning. And there are some universities that are, foregoing calculus, and instead of calculus, teaching more linear algebra and more machine learning and statistics, because in many cases those are the skill sets that people are going to use. But again, we can't wait for the educational system to catch up. We as an industry need to be focusing internally on training programs to make sure that we have those bilingual leaders, and that we're kind of preparing ourselves for the future.
As a brief follow-up point, this reminds me in part of the prophetic paper by Leo Brayman in 2001 on the two cultures, where he's at the onset of the machine learning wave at that time, he made the point that statisticians are often sort of culturally in favor of models that are truly explanatory, in that they have a specific theory about the mechanism that's generating the data, and they want to confirm or disprove that theory. Whereas the machine learning sort of wave and ecosystem is more focused about predictive accuracy out of sample, which is also a way to validate an algorithm, but in a different way. And this bilingual, maybe there's a third dimension to consider, right? There's the clinical language, and there's the statistical language, and the machine learning communities. And I wonder how, as a leader of an organization that is combining all these three groups, how do you approach that on a day-to-day basis, that fusion of the cultures?
Yeah, so again, I think we often describe Valo as the first end-to-end, the first digitally native end-to-end pharmaceutical company. And part of that is not just the fact that we rely a lot on machine learning and data, but and don't get me wrong, just building the technical capabilities to go after these problems is really difficult, but it's 50% of the effort. The other 50% is making sure that these cultures, the problem we just talked about, that these cultures are working properly together, making sure that incentives are aligned from across the organization, making sure that the data scientists and the clinicians, or the data scientists and the biologists and chemists are working together. And so there's a lot of effort that we've done in putting together teams, making sure that those teams understand that one is not in service to the other. One sub-discipline's not in service to the other, that they're all accountable for the success and failure of certain efforts. And so I think it's an ongoing effort. I can't say that we've totally solved it, but we are actively actively experimenting and often failing at this. And I will openly admit we're failing at it sometimes, but actively thinking about how we design teams, how we set up incentive structures, how we make sure that we're getting the best out of all of the worlds.
Yep, that makes a lot of sense. And I guess as a final question, one of the classic failure modes that we see the industry falling into is doing something really innovative and groundbreaking once, and not being able to scale that to other diseases, other products, other scientific questions, whatever it might be. How do you think we break out of that cycle? How do you think we move from one use case to analytics at scale? And obviously there's tons of discussions about MLOps and all things like that. What do you see as the biggest kind of enablers and unlocks there?
Yeah, well, so with our industry, right, we have a really long tail of what I would call long tail of data, right? In that, you have input in one narrow slice of a therapeutic area, you have certain data modalities that are critical to diagnosis, to treatment. But if you even within cardiovascular disease, for example, you move slightly in terms of indication, and all of a sudden those data modalities change. the timing of when you need those data from, in terms of disease progression changes. And so really kind of there's this what I call long tail of data sets that we need depending on the disease. So I think, in many cases, I think we need to be taking clues from more high tech, more kind of here in Silicon Valley, thinking about platforms, thinking about providing platforms, providing not only platforms, building and providing those platforms not only internally within our own companies, but more broadly, right? Starting to share those capabilities, share those data, and really kind of build up a set of tools that even though we have that long tail of different disease modalities, different data needs, as we start to kind of build up the backbone, the ML ops, the platform pieces, the data fusion techniques, we will begin to be able to generalize, and we'll see generalization, right? This is one of the things that's really tough, but this is not an unknown problem in technology, that you don't know exactly how this is going to generalize. So you need to start building up the basics, start with the data layer, start with the ops layer, start with the ML layer, start to build up, continually use it in various places, see, oh well, this pattern is emerging from what we're doing here, let's build that next piece, let's build that next API, and then start to expose that. So I think we need to take we as an industry need to take much more of a platform view to this. While, again, we're used to thinking patients and thinking again, very much towards individual indications, individual things, and we end up with these ad hoc analyses, which are great for that small group of patients. But it doesn't. But other than teaching the data scientists, go, oh yeah, we did this one thing like 5 years ago, and I think I'm kind of seeing that pattern again in the thing I'm looking at today. I'm going to redo that, right? I've seen that both in real world data. I've seen it in chemistry. I've seen it in biology. I love those moments where I'm watching these individual practitioners, be it clinicians, be it epidemiologists or medicinal chemists, even, you start to see that they've got this kind of, they've built this pattern, they've built this kind of recognition engine within their own brains, and they can see it. So that there's an ability to build generalized capabilities, because you can see it in individuals that are practitioners of it, right? So as we start to do that, we needed to kind of distill out of them, what are those patterns? What can we platformize, if you'll let me use a made-up word, and put behind APIs that then can be used more broadly by not only data scientists, but by the primary scientists themselves.
That's fascinating insight, Brandon. Thank you very much for your time. I think we're just about on time, and I guess by way of wrapping us up, I wanted to take a step back and think about how important to the public and to patients the promise of AI for the life sciences is. Yeah, I mean, it's something that people have been waiting on for a while, and it feels like we are at a pivotal moment in the history of that evolution. I think increasingly the AI community has matured. It's developing best practices. It's using replicable and reproducible technology. The capture of data, the digitization, in part driven by other factors like, for example, telemedicine, as you say, is itself maturing and becoming more standardized. And I think we are at a crossroads, and it's sort of on us, as you said earlier, right, to take that challenge head on. So it was a real pleasure talking to you today, and I think that we can now open up for some Q&A. Thank you, Alex, as well.
Thanks, Brandon. Thanks a lot.
Okay, folks. So that was a pre-recorded session, so we're not going to do Q&A, but we're going to move on to the next and final session today. If you bear with us for just a couple of minutes, we're going to just set up the stage for a panel discussion. So please hang on. It should be a great talk around age tech and age-related technologies in wearables specifically. So do hang around a couple of minutes, maybe less, and we'll be back with you. Okay, so welcome back to Giant Health for the final session of today. Great to have you all here. Nice, a lot of people in the room still. I know things are winding down after 2 days back in person. It's been fantastic to meet lots of new people, and I'm sure you've all had some great connections and interactions. We're going to have a discussion now around a topic that's close to my heart in terms of wearable technology, but we have some experts here who are going to talk specifically around their experience and what they're doing out there in the real world. And the topic of today's panel discussion is supporting better aging through wearable technology. So I'm going to leave the speakers to introduce themselves, and then we're going to dive in. One thing I will ask in a moment is just to get a sense of who's in the room, and then we can kind of tailor what our answers are based upon that. But we'll do the introductions first, and then we'll come back to that. So let's start at the end. Catherine.
So, hello, I'm Catherine Church. I'm the Chief Digital Officer for Surrey Heartland's Integrated Care System. And for those of you who are not familiar with how the NHS operates, Integrated Care Systems are a new statutory body within the NHS, which brings together health and social care as an integrated way of managing and delivering health and social care in the UK. As of April the 1st, there will be 42 integrated care systems, and I'm the Chief Digital Officer for one of them. So Surrey is the patch that I operate across. So we're quite a large geographical patch, 1.1 million people, rural, quite rural, relatively wealthy, but with real pockets of deprivation. And we also have a quite significantly higher proportion of elderly people, so older adults in our patch, and that is both older adults and carers. So more people with carers and older carers. So this is a really important topic to us.
Hi everyone, my name's Louise Rogerson. So I'm a physiotherapist specialising in neurological conditions and older people. I'm the co-founder of House, and House is a home monitoring system and designed to help healthy ageing and keep people at home for longer. But I have also worked in the NHS for quite a long time and worked as a commissioner. So I've got quite a breadth of experience in this space.
Hello. Yep. So hello everyone, my name is Zeke. I'm the founder of a health tech startup called Milbotics, and we are creating smart socks to address behavioral issues with dementia specifically, but also with wider applications in telehealth. I think my sort of journey into this area began with my great-grandmother, her having dementia and going through the process of developing behavioral symptoms. That really kind of kick-started my journey into this area, led to a PhD, relevant PhD, and now I'm really trying to commercialize that research, hopefully with real impact, I'd say.
Fantastic. The microphone's magically working again here, so I've got this one. So first of all, I wanted to just see who's in the room. So we've got, I reckon, 25 or 30 people here. I've got 6 categories. I'd love a hand for anyone who's in any of these categories, who considers themselves predominantly in one of these categories. So I'll run through them first, and then I'll go back through, and if you could put your hand up on cue, that would be fantastic. So investors, entrepreneurs, healthcare professionals, first 3. Academics, corporate or SMEs, and other. And I'll come back to the other afterwards. So I'll just run through again. If I could get a show of hands, I expect a hand from everyone. I shall be coming back around if you don't give me one. So please tell me who you are. Investors, first of all. Who's investment people? Fantastic. So 1, 2, 3, 4 investors. Entrepreneurs. Great. 4 or 5 entrepreneurs. Healthcare professionals. 1, 2, 3. I think, Louise, you're an entrepreneur predominantly, aren't you? No? Okay. Academics. Got an academic here. Corporates, SME. Couple of corporate SMEs. There's a lot of people going to be in other then. I want to show of hands from everyone who didn't put their hand up before. Right. So I'm going to pick on you over in the corner. What do you do? Where are you from?
I work for a localization company. So in a nutshell, translation, but a bit more. Alpha CRC from Cambridge.
Okay. Fantastic. Anyone else who had their hand up? Yep. Clinical director. Okay. Next. Yep. You have to speak up a fraction. Regional government in Belgium, fantastic. Well, I didn't have that on my list, so fair play. Anyway, anyone else? Were you? You're done, were you? Anyone else want to put their hand up and tell me where they're from or what they're up to? No. Okay, let's leave it at that. That's great. So a pretty big, great mix, in fact. A good balance between who's here, and we know a little bit more now about who we're talking to and what we're going to ask. So we've decided on a sort of framing for this discussion. So we're going to start with just putting that out there so that you know kind of where we're trying to get to, and we can ebb and flow and move forward. We'd love some questions. So if people have questions, stick your hand up, ask those questions on the fly at the end, whatever. We're not going to sort of have any real formal process here. It's going to be a kind of Q&A and a discussion. I'll just keep things moving, hopefully. So the question that we posed is, we want to explore the state of play, opportunities and blockers in the development of products and services to support better aging through wearable technology. So the key words there, I guess, being opportunities and blockers. So where are the challenges that we're facing? Where are the actual opportunities that exist? And those working in the NHS will really understand how to deploy those things and what works and what doesn't. So we'll kind of converge on those themes, and hopefully at the end we'll have a good understanding of that question. We'll see. I'm going to go in reverse order, I think, and ask you, Zeke, first of all, to kind of try and give us a starter for 10 for that question. Opportunities and blockers in terms of healthy aging.
Okay, well, I think it's been widely recognized that technology has a role to play in promoting healthy aging and promoting really better outcomes for people as they age, as well as around disabilities and general health. I think that the funding is starting to fall into place. So certainly with Innovate UK, so I've been applying for a lot of grants to try and get my company started. There've been quite a few opportunities over the past sort of 6 months. So I've been able to apply, have not quite heard back whether I've been successful yet. So that's another question. Is there sufficient funding given the level of demand for that funding? Yeah, I mean, I think, like I said, it's been recognized. It's a case of now, can the support that's needed be made available to the people that are trying to deliver that change?
Okay, so I have several hats, but I think for me, the question about healthy aging is there's a myth that, so I have a bit of a personal thing about pictures of older people doing like a skydiving and stuff and going up to space and all of those kind of things. The reality of it is aging is actually quite hard work. You are unfortunately sitting here declining, and you need to really work on that. And the people who are looking after the older people who are declining themselves. So if anyone's been in the situation with mum and dad at home or grandparents, because I'm like quite old now, but you can see that they're that dynamic between them and they're aging together. And what you see is this really amazing ecosystem between two people propping each other up. And we were just saying earlier, one of those breaks and you are in trouble. And for me, healthy aging is about maximizing what we can do. Don't accept the deterioration. You can work as hard as you can, but also don't be afraid of stuff that will help you. So I like to focus on your positive aging journey. It's okay that I've got a few more wrinkles. It's actually fine. We have to just go with it. So I would say, for me, technology needs to be more embedded in daily life, but more constructive and make the data very, very relevant about stuff we can do something about. Telling me the depth of the wrinkles on my face is not going to make my life better. But telling me a muscle that is weak, that needs strengthening, or balance that is starting to fail, that I can do something about is really exciting. And that for me is where the technology needs to be. Think elite athletes monitoring their performance all the time to improve it. That's what we need to do. And older people getting that technology and stop seeing it as something to monitor their failings, but to monitor their progress.
Brilliant, thank you. So thinking about that, there's huge opportunities were made really obvious to the NHS as part of COVID. So February 2020, we just moved overnight to not wanting or it not being appropriate to send clinicians into people's homes. And we were doing everything that we possibly could to avoid people from coming into hospital who didn't need to come into hospital, of course, because of all the infection risks and the fact that there were many other people in hospital with COVID. So that whole building an ecosystem around people that enabled us to ensure that they were as well as they could be in their own homes is extraordinarily important. Opening up portals into people's homes so that practitioners, clinicians, physios could actually come into the home and carry out things like virtual consultations. So be that in somebody's home or in a care home was really, really important, and something that we deployed at quite some scale. And then I think you're spot on, Louise, is ensuring, especially when people were isolated at home on their own, that their carers were well and safe. So having an ecosystem that enables you to ensure that the carer, the person's carer, is getting appropriate rest, is getting appropriate support, is getting contact, human contact, as well as contact from medics is extraordinarily important. And one of the things we did in Surrey was actually scale some remote monitoring ecosystem, an ecosystem of connected medical devices to do exactly that. So when you can't get people coming into medical establishments, ensure that the medical establishment can reach out into their homes.
Super, thank you, Catherine. So let's go back around just linearly again with the next question, which is a general one. So in terms of your experiences and what you're up to, you've just kind of touched on that. Can you just sort of give us a bit more in terms of age-related conditions that you've interacted with, and especially with that sort of pragmatic lens? What are the things that you're finding really have got solutions out there that you've touched, I suppose? It's dead then, right? Okay.
I've got really good. There we go. So the things that we're focusing on age-related conditions are frailty. So if we look at actually the conditions that in our patch in Surrey, the things that are affecting the most people and that have the most impact and consequences on the NHS are frailty and falls is a huge driver of visits to GPs, of conveyances to A&E, to GPs going out to people's homes and admission. So that's going to be a constant. That's going to be a constant for anybody in the NHS is understanding people's tendency to fall, the impacts of falls, getting services wrapped around people so they're not lying on the floor degenerating before ambulances can get to them. And there's the converse, so there's the whole admission prevention, but then there's also the enabling discharge. And the majority of people who are stuck in hospital are because it's not safe for them to go home, or we haven't put in place the support mechanisms for people to be able to go home. And that's complicated. It's coordinating big packages of human care from maybe a range of different agencies that are pressurized. And that's where really the opportunity for tech is so strong. So we're working on a number of programs around packages of integrated digital and hands-on care that enable people, and that can be prescribed in hospital to enable people to leave earlier. So that's one major area, and the other is dementia, but we've got colleagues who are more expert on that, so I'll pass on to Louise.
So I think if I think back to my physiotherapy days when I qualified, we used to see people with neurological, like stroke. You would see them at home, you would keep seeing them for quite a long time. Parkinson's disease, we keep seeing them over a long period of time. Now, unfortunately, we can't do that. So if anyone has the misfortune of going to see a physiotherapist these days, A, we are brutal. It will hurt. And the second thing is you'll end up with a big wad of paper to go home with. And I think that's a bit of a disappointment for me. I trained for 4 years to not be replaced by a piece of paper. Going to video is not transformational, but physiotherapists think that is transformational. Ooh, video consults. No, what's transformational is actually what we do when we see people is that I'm watching you walk, I'm watching you sit, I'm looking around the room thinking, oh, that's a lopsided shoulder. Imagine if we could have technology that would pop out and say, actually, this is brewing. This is starting to be a problem. And actually then we could put our intervention instead of into monitoring, but actually into delivering an intervention. Really exciting, because this means that you can actually spend your money at the point of need rather than spending a lot of time checking in and assessing. And if you ask patients, and I'm calling them patients deliberately, if you ask patients to contact you when they need to, you can guarantee it will be late, way too late. So technology opportunity for me, it's all about that. And that's what wearables are. It's that continuous monitoring. And our analytics that we've developed is change detection. So the point of change is the point where you need to sit down and say, what has changed now? Because now is probably the time to do something about it. So I think that's for me.
Yeah, so I'm primarily focused on dementia. And I've been talking to a lot of care homes, and something that I've found that they struggle with is really around the training and the fragmentation of the technology landscape. So a lot of care homes are looking at adopting technologies, but they're finding that they've got to install a dozen different apps. Each time they do that, they have to train the staff. They've got very high rates of staff turnover, and they're constantly spinning on a wheel, trying to get the technology working for them. But in the end, they're investing more effort in just getting the technology in place rather than deriving benefits from it. So I think that fragmentation of the landscape is something that really needs to be addressed. And I think probably, Louise, you're working in that area with, bringing everything together. And then another issue that I've come up against is around stigma. So people with dementia tend to be quite private about the condition. They don't really want to publicize the fact that they have dementia. And you find that certainly with wearable technologies, they can be quite stigmatizing. Wristbands, devices that are very, very much on view, it causes that concern that people are going to single them out as being different. So I think that's something we need to work on, and certainly through the work that I'm doing with smart socks, really looking at providing something that is non-stigmatizing, very familiar, something that can fit in with people's daily lives, so they don't have to change their behaviors, and that can provide that sort of remote data to clinicians potentially to improve health outcomes and provide benefits.
Thanks, Zeke. I'm going to ask Catherine to touch on that sort of, I think we jokingly have called it badges of vulnerability and various other things, this kind of pendant around the neck stuff. What's your experience with that sort of technology?
Well, so again, from working across, and it tends to be local authorities that have these telecare or telehealth program, and they're as old-fashioned as the word would indicate. So the pull cords that people have around their necks with the horrible big red button, and they're really nasty grey plastic. Sorry if there's anybody in the room that's a manufacturer of these devices, but they would acknowledge that themselves. And the TSA are doing a huge amount of work to really think about that form function and the customer experience. So the whole range of things that we see, crash mats, decelerometers, devices on the wrist, things that go around the neck. The main thing that happens, in fact, most of these are associated with a monitoring service. So there's somebody at the end of the phone, or they can bring an ambulance out, and they'll find that half the time the individual has knocked the device off the bedside table because it's really horrible, or they've turned over and it looks as though they've fallen, and that triggers all kinds of false alarms. And then, of course, a lot of people, and they're often given to people with dementia, so you can track and see if somebody is fuging, which is a horrible word, actually. It's a really horrible word. But if somebody has got confused and has wandered into places that may not be quite so safe, then the first thing that anybody does is take it off, as you say, that badge of shame of there's something weird and different and someone's going to come and take me home. So we just, the outcomes are not great. There's some amazing people who work in these environments, and there's some really, really good work done. But think about that versus the usability of a Fitbit. Nobody. It's a badge of pride to have an Apple Watch. And if we could actually create the same kind of form function, or a really cool pair of cashmere socks that people would be proud to wear, then I think we'd be onto a good thing.
Fantastic. So we'll come on to whether there's bill of materials budget for cashmere in your product. Louise, Fitbits were mentioned, and also what I thought was interesting in that is the idea of service, and we talked about this recently, local authorities having budgets cut. Can you talk a bit more around that idea of the service and the and those things? Yeah.
So all the work we've been doing, so we started with home monitoring and an app, and it'll tell you when things are going awry, and it's for the family, blah, 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 blah. Technology, we worked with an organization recently, a health organization. They said, I want technology that never fails and works all the time. So I left. The point is that it doesn't work all the time. None of it does, right? And so what we've been doing, and we've had the opportunity to work with Catherine in Surrey on this, which is providing the service that goes with it. So what we had to do was, we had to trust that our kit could be self-installed. So I spent a lot of time with hardware, seeing how hard it was to open, batteries that last a long time. And what we've realized is it is the service. So the evaluation of the Surrey service is not that the technology alone will keep people at home, but it's the service that goes with it. I did some work recently. We had a geriatrician going to visit some of our customers to do an interview to see where we were at. And he came back and he went, "Oh, they love you guys." And I'm like, "Of course they do." He said, no, your customer service is amazing. Like, you're amazing. Like, you're so there. And I'm like, I've probably heard from them once a year. But the fact is, when they do want us, we are there. And the Surrey work is that when something goes awry, we are ringing them, so they believe someone's got their back. And I think that's what we have to do, is someone's got your back. I don't know, is anyone here a carer or aware of a carer? Yeah, right. So sometimes you just need someone to go, "Oh, last night was a bit rough, wasn't it? You all right? You had a cup of tea this morning?" And that is what actually makes a difference, because I can't come and care for the person. That's not possible. So one of the things we need to look at is a service where you've got a carer that goes and visits one afternoon a week. How much does that cost? Could a technology go in there in a service that just checks in at the point of need? Could that then be done for the same amount of money? Yeah, it can actually. And also empower families to do it. Families involved in a service. We so often discount families in our planning. So let's bring them in. So I think we've got to, what we are doing now is providing a service that goes with the technology, and you want to get in with companies that do service to help alongside your technology. You know, we've got to work together to do this. And what we're doing is taking all the admin side out, all of that admin, the technology, when they do a reading and it says blood pressure 290, you wouldn't be ringing me if it was 290, would you? So let's just sit down, wait 10 minutes, do it again. And only then, if it really is up, so we had one the other day, 171 over 126, which gave me anxiety sat there, I have to tell you, because a diastolic that high is not great. But the monitoring team were there. They contacted the GP practice. They put him on a new medication, and he started that day. Without his blood pressure at home, that wouldn't have been detected. But it needed some sense to say that is a real, genuine reading. And we did it 3 times and it was real. So those service side of things, very, very important. And you've got to talk to the people that are going to do something about the things you're finding. Don't give me stuff I can do nothing about.
I'm gonna stick with you a minute and just go back to sort of the local authority bit, because we talked about how funding had been cut in many cases. Finding technologies that slot in to deal with that health economics issue, basically. Are there big kind of candidate areas where you can have less of that personal service and that cost, and technologies to drop in easily? Or are you just going to say, no, we need lots of people on the street?
Well, it's interesting, but it's very, very unpopular to say you're bringing people out. That is like the last thing you're ever going to say.
It's reality though, right?
No, it is the reality, but the last thing, well, I'm saying the last thing Boris would say, but let's be honest, he probably would say it, wouldn't he? But what you don't want to stand up and say is, we've got a technology, which means no one needs to see your mum anymore. That is not that.
Yeah. So just to add into that, we're never going to be taking people out because there is so much unmet demand. So it just allows you, it just allows you to the scarce resources that you have to really deploy them at that point of need.
Yeah. So what we are seeing now is that local authorities are starting to switch on to the idea of predictive. So they don't want reactive anymore. They've started to realise that telling you too late is costly. What we are seeing is they do want care optimization. So if you've got something that you can put in that will allow them to be more efficient, so like I say, getting rid of check-in visits, then there's definitely opportunity there. Tenders are starting to come out now, so they all seem to be on a bit of the same 5-year cycle, so they'll sort of the next year or two. And what we're seeing is more requests for predictive technology to go in. So whatever guise that's in, there's definitely space there. That is an opportunity. And I think the other side of it is self-funding. Councils, when you go to the council and the council said, we can't help you, you don't qualify, the next thing they do is they give you a list of things that's self-funded. Most councils, it is just a car crash of kit, and you wouldn't have a clue. So you end up going with the incumbent telecare provider quite often. So that is a disruptive space needed. So social prescribing, getting it a little bit before you hit that point might be another place to go to integrate with some of those systems to get yourself on that option list. That's something we're trying to do now.
Fantastic, thanks. At that point, are there any questions that have come up so far in the discussion? Have a think. There's a few themes we've talked about. You know, the pragmatics, I suppose, of what's out there and what can be done. The service, you know, things that are actually happening out there in the NHS. Some of the challenges. Yeah, you're going to heckle like promised.
Really good panel debate, by the way. I just wondered, how do you deal with this dynamic when you are incorporating a new technology like wearable tech? You know, there's going to be some sort of expense at the beginning, but you're working in an environment where you have to save money. How do you deal with that kind of dynamic to make a valuable case? Because that in itself is going to take a bit of investment. How do you deal with that tension?
Well, you smile at investors in the room for a start. And I can do a bit about it just from our side. We did a lot of accelerator programs. We got in with, we made a specific decision to go via the commercial sector. So we went as a consumer proposition, worked with utility companies to prove our worth, then went to the NHS with a thing that was done, that had been through the rounds a wee bit. And we did, the work we did was, we also did supported work with universities. So we supported a PhD, we supported postdoc work to get some of that hard research done, to get the evidence behind it. So we went commercial, and then we've come back round, and then we've found partners that are prepared to fund. I'm looking at Catherine, because a partner that's prepared to fund an evaluation to then give us some evidence at the end of that. Yeah. Do you want to?
Yeah, I think the NHS, well, NHSX that was until last week, has got a really good funding stream. So they've got some really good funding streams for investment in, and it's not early tech, because you're all medical devices registered, and it's safe and proven technology. But there's some really good programs that come down. So there's a focus in the NHS on social care, on prevention, on artificial intelligence. So there's some big pots of money that come down. They still at the moment can be quite time limited, but with the move to ICSs, the decision around funding for digital and other technologies will come at an ICS level. And then you've got much more autonomy in terms of deciding on the return on investment, but getting that early. So the program that we've been doing is 12 months, and we've seen some demonstrable reduction in A&E admissions, ambulance conveyances, admissions to care homes. Admissions to care homes at £1,000 a week is probably, and that, I mean, that was probably pre-COVID. It's our patch is Surrey. They're quite nice care homes in the main, and that is an enormous cost for the local authority. The in-state hospital and conveyances. Ambulance conveyances, a massive cost for the NHS. So bringing those two, the ICS coming together and looking at that end-to-end pathway, the business case writes itself.
Another question at the back. Can we just maybe get a mic back to the gentleman right at the back?
Thank you.
Sorry, just first gentleman back there, and then a few afterwards. Thanks.
Yeah, just following on from that, I know you're from the ICS, Mid-Surrey ICS, but it's not very clear where the budget responsibilities are going to lie with the ICSs, because obviously there's the former CCG, which had health responsibility, the council's responsible for social care. So where is that happening in different ways around the country, or how's it? Yeah, if you can just say a bit about how that's going to work.
Yeah, so I mean, it isn't yet completely set out. It isn't completely set out. So the statutory body will be the ICS. They will have the same responsibilities as the CCG did. The funding mechanism will be through grant mechanism from central government based on population health needs analysis. The mechanisms, the exact mechanisms for how that's going to happen is not yet been determined. So the guidance is coming out as we speak. What is seeming reasonably clear is that responsibility for digital and data strategy and investment will be at an ICS level. So that gives us the ability to bring those scale digital solutions across and invest in those on a much bigger footprint. But there's loads of complexities in there, and it's being worked through as we speak. But it's definitely, to my mind, a massive step in the right direction.
Hi. I have one, let's say, more practical question regarding the technologies which are used nowadays for purposes of monitoring. So are there any kind of solutions that is like governmental supposed to be used, or is there something you want to buy and then integrate to other solutions, or how these things are actually working nowadays? Thank you.
I don't think there's really much coordination from what I've seen. So it seems like there are disparate groups of the NHS care homes. Everybody's operating separately, and nothing's really pooling it together. So people are making their own decisions, and that's proving challenging because then the technology doesn't talk to each other. So inevitably, you can't leverage the full spectrum of data that you're collecting. So I think perhaps on a policy level, maybe there needs to be a bit more coordination. But then again, the challenge with that is that then you've got new technology coming in all the time. And if you're trying to standardize, how can you ensure that you're bringing in the best and the latest technology? It just seems very difficult, and I'm not sure what the solution is for that. But Catherine might have an idea.
Well, I've got just another follow-on question in relation to, I was on a panel last week and I was asked about the larger tech companies getting out of health tech and kind of realizing that it was a bit of a hard nut to crack. And I think it all links back to things like, 10, 15 years ago, where the NHS was trying to create a wonderful sort of IT infrastructure and it all fell apart. It's really complex. And I don't really see a point in the future where it's not. And I think that's really going to be a challenge for a long time. So all these disparate things, as you know, are intractable from a company like Google, who want to have, ubiquity and simplicity and platform-led technologies. And I just think they've realized that it's not going to happen very, very soon. And those things flow all the way through the NHS systems. Traditional care is impossibly difficult and complex and interconnected and full of paper. The future's full of all sorts of other computer systems that are disparately linked at the moment. That's how it looks.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's interesting is that the consumer market's starting to have an effect. So the bring your own device is like becoming a reality, and the NHS doesn't cope well with bring your own device. And government structures don't cope with it very well. So we just said, we'll allow people to use their own tablets. And the NHS went, oh, no, you must provide them with a really rubbish tablet that must be locked down, must have device management. And no, you can't give them a password that's locked in. They're people with dementia. No, you definitely can't give them the credentials locked into the tablet because that's not safe. Hello. That's the kind of problem you're going to face. And so I think, like, we're hardware agnostic, so we'll be having a conversation after this, because the whole point is we're saying we just can integrate lots and lots of things in together. But I think what we need to do is get onto the data standards. So we've done some work, again, it's NHS, but and local authority around data standards, and it's all medical driven. It's interventions, surgical procedures, diagnoses. As a physio, I'm like, I don't really care. How are they getting out of a chair? There isn't a code for that, or there is, but no one uses it. So I think we've got to, for me, one of our things is about getting the data standards. So we're working in Surrey, we're applying for funding to try and get the data standards better for some of the softer stuff. They call it like the soft signs. And I think that will then allow a technology to sit on top of that. And that's where we need to get to, is that sort of like the creating the data standards that mean you can tip your stuff into a data lake. In Surrey, I don't think I'm speaking out of turn if I tell you that the data we collected, the only way they could cope with it was in a CSV file that would go and sit in a file in a system somewhere, because they didn't actually know what to do with what I'd given them. And that breaks your heart into a million pieces. So I think we have to I think there's a bit of that data standards. And I know there's been some stuff just recently about AI and getting data structure so that you can actually start putting this stuff together. And I just think that's where the ICS has to really come together, like health and social care, like, and AHPs, like allied health professionals, need to get in and start muscling in the doctors.
Right, I'm gonna come and ask you in a minute about NHS Direct, NHSX, and what happened. You'll know the inside track. I'm sure we'd like to know. But Zeke, first of all, just going back a few steps to kind of commercialization and creating a business model, I suppose, around a technology that you're trying to get into an established healthcare system that's potentially got a few rough edges and incompatibilities. What's your strategy for that as an entrepreneur and someone who's trying to jump into that world with the technology?
Yeah, it's very challenging. I mean, I think I'm quite fortunate to have that academic grounding for what I'm doing. So having had the opportunity to develop the technology with a care provider, collecting some evidence, and then being able to justify additional work to carry it forward. I know there are people that aren't in that situation that are also working in this area, trying to create health tech businesses. They have the vision, they have the drive, but they don't really have that evidence to start with. And inevitably, it's difficult to get traction if you can't say, look, these are the benefits. So I think it's really a case of supporting those very early stage businesses to be able to demonstrate the benefits of their technology potentially. So in terms of my sort of own journey, I'm really trying to carry forward the work that I've done through some additional feasibility studies. So working with people with dementia very closely, collecting additional data to support the use of the product, the wearable, and again, also quantifying the health economics. I think that's very important with these sorts of technologies. If you want to get into the NHS, you have to be able to say, look, these are going to be the cost savings if you introduce this technology. And it all costs money. So really, I think we need a lot more willingness from the investor community to take risks with these sorts of technologies. They're going to have a tremendous impact. Certainly with dementia, we're seeing, a real surge in the number of people that are developing dementia. So, it's an opportunity. It's something that's growing, and there's obviously that social impact as well to really make a difference.
Just before we move on, the investors in the room, are they still here? I forgot where the hands were. Who are the investors? They haven't all left. They've all left to go early finish for the investors. Never mind. I was going to ask them if they're investing in sort of an NHS destined health tech, and I'd be really interested to know about that.
Can I just... Sorry, just to add to that, just to say that I'm sitting here thinking your smart socks should be in John Lewis, because we're obsessed about getting into the NHS, and actually we're all our own health managers now. We do so much for our health before we've even touched the health system. So actually we've got to get it so that these things are just available for anyone to use, and that they just so happen to be really brilliant for people with dementia. Because I guess, as a stand just gone over there, but that early detection of problems, Parkinson's disease, just as an example, most people have had Parkinson's disease for 5 years before they get diagnosed. So they've only got 10% of the bit of the brain left, the substantia nigra. They've only got like 10% left when they get diagnosed. They're that depleted. That is scary stuff. And that is the point that we need to get this in. So I think part of it is daring to say, we've had this conversation, haven't we? A commercial product. What is the other place that this can be of benefit? We're doing a trial in Portugal, and with people with dementia, they've just we did this walkthrough yesterday, and the families have all said, brilliant for mum, but I'd like a kit for home for the teenagers, please, because we leave teenagers on their own at the weekend, and we don't know what they're doing. And we would like it at home, please. Can we buy another kit? Of course you can. There's not going to be a no from a commercial company to say no to that, but that's what we've got to do. We've got to follow that to give it the validity. So smart socks in John Lewis, right?
Fantastic. So I don't know if everyone's aware of the sort of merger of NHS Digital, NHSX, and NHS England. Have I got that right? So NHSX being this big fanfare organisation created 2 or 3 years ago.
Matt Hancock.
Okay, let's not talk about that. Say no more. And I think it's interesting how this kind of constant process of sort of integration and change always happens in these big organisations. But Catherine, what's going on with that, and where does it lead us, especially in terms of what we're talking about now? But start with the general.
Yeah. So I'm not an NHS professional by background. I've been in the NHS for 2 years, so I joined precisely at the same time as COVID. Hopefully haven't, yes, exactly. Hopefully I've had a slightly better effect on the NHS than COVID. But my background is banking, financial services. And I just wanted to come back to this thing about data standards and integration. in banking and finance, we've got global standards for processing of payments, for example. And that has been driven by commercial reasons of needing to be able to trade globally. And the NHS does have standards. We have a data dictionary, PRSB data dictionary. We have fire integration standards. There are APIs, all of the things that you would expect an organisation to have, or a regulator. NHS England is our regulator and standards setter. They are all there. I think what's missing is that obligation to comply with those, and that's because of the state of legacy tech. So and the vendors have got a massive part to play in this. And anyway, so if I was at an NHS conference, there would be people from the vendors who've heard me say this constantly over the last 2 years. Companies that hold on to their data within, you know, and have proprietary reporting solutions and will not allow their data to flow out of their systems, and don't comply with those standards, should just simply not be allowed to be in receipt of public money. So there we go. That's my bit. So it's not that the NHS doesn't have those standards; it does. So that's the first bit. So when I joined, in my first couple of months, I was just utterly bewildered. So I had these briefs from NHS Digital, and they're setting the strategy, and then they've got NHSX, you know, a bit more funky, bit more cool, and they were setting the strategy, and they do some really cool stuff with startups. So there's a whole process called DTAG. And the NHS brand might have gone, but the structures will still be there. So there's a whole set of projects and people really curious and interested in startups, and so DTAC, I'll connect you in with some people. And and then then the NHS is regional. So I've got a regional digital team. I've got one for secondary care and I've got one for primary care. And my head just exploded a few months in. I was like, who is setting the tone? What do I do locally? What happens regionally? What gets done nationally? So national products like the NHS Spine, which is the record of all of us. And then what gets done by NHSX? And it was just massively confusing. And then the Laura Wade Geary team came along and said, we want to talk to ICS leaders. And I probably wasn't as kind of circumspect as I maybe would be now. I was just like, my head is exploding. Who is setting the strategy? Who's setting the stone? Who's setting the rules and the tone of all of this? And there we go. So they clearly listened, and so thank you, me, for that. So what is going to happen is that the under Tim Ferriss, digital will come under transformation as part of an integrated transformation unit, and I think that is a really good thing. I think that is a really, really good thing. It will streamline the programs. It will streamline the contact points. It should give NHS England real good leverage with suppliers and the ecosystem, and hopefully I'll make it simple for me to understand who's setting the strategy. That will be NHSX. NHS Digital will be like the IT department, so they'll do the big kind of core systems we all have to use and look after the kind of plumbing and infrastructure, cybersecurity, stuff like that. And then there'll be a national data, well, there is a national data strategy and there'll be a lead for that. But all of that will come under the major transformation programs. So I think it's a really good thing.
Okay. Good, brilliant. And in terms of like impacts on healthy aging and technology, investment, as it were, innovation programs, is it super clear what's going to happen, or is it just all up in the air in terms of where the money's going to go and where it's coming from?
So the detailed integration plans haven't been published, but the direction of travel around simplicity, integration, speaking with one voice, all of that has been set out. And as I say, I haven't been in the NHS for very long, so I still have Zebedee enthusiasm in the organisation's ability to deliver this in a coherent way. And the reason why I'm still so enthusiastic is the vaccinations programme. So if you look at that and look at the tech, and if anyone, well, hopefully we've all had at least 2. I've had 3 vaccinations. My process was end-to-end digital. So from being called up to being sent maps to being able to walk into a vaccination centre, they know who I am, check my medical records, look at any counterindications, record that get back to my GP surgery, and all of that arrive on the app. And we've done that in 12 months, 12, 18 months. All of that is end-to-end digital. There's not a bit of paper in sight in Brighton. And that data goes into national data sets that allows for really targeted population health management and really focus ways of reaching out to hard to reach populations. So if we can do that and deliver 90 million vaccinations on top of everything else, then there's a really good platform to do other really cool stuff.
Fantastic.
I should work for recruitment for the NHS, shouldn't I?
Not the NHSX though, not anymore. So I'm going to jump onto in-home stuff because you're very much in that space. Are you seeing a kind of trend towards adoption in that area? It's kind of getting people out of hospitals, looking after them more. It's something we talk about a lot in terms of an area of focus commercially. We're really interested in that. Is the NHS really open to that, and is it coming out and happening?
Yeah, we've got discharge pathways. So discharge to assess has been around a while, which is you used to be in hospital, you'd get assessed, get set up, then go home. Now we'll take you home and do it all at the same time. So it streamlines that process, and technology is seen as part of that. It's still quite old school at the moment, but yeah, we're about to start a trial in Salford, providing our equipment at the point of discharge. And the question I'm asking myself is, can we shorten the rehab phase? I know it's coming out of my mouth, I'm saying that, but can you shorten the rehab phase, but then do another brief intervention if things don't stay as they ought to when people go home? So go home, they do their good routine, they eat and drink, and then they start to tail off. Actually, a brief intervention at that point. So I think there's that. I think there is a longitudinal approach to it now. So it's much less short vision. People are starting to think of the longer term. And from the ground up, there's a bit more integration with care. So we're starting to realise that the care needs to be right. So I think that is definitely starting to shift. And I think people more and more likely to have in-home technologies sitting there. And can we make use of those?
And is that kind of consistent with more complex pathways where people have comorbidities and they're sort of looking for multiple things at the same time, or all those things disparate sort of offerings?
I'm probably the wrong person to ask because I'm a symptom-based approach to what I do. So I deal with the symptoms. The diagnosis and the disease-specific piece is actually out in the home. They're still siloed at the moment, so it is still a challenge. But I think more and more with the integration with care, people are looking after the person, focusing on them being okay, and then taking the other stuff offline and taking them in to do those specific assessments. So I think treatment management plans now are much more tailored to the person and ever more should be so, I think. And I think we should take a nod to some of the cancer specialties that have done a really good job of that.
Yeah, fantastic. So that's positive. So things are changing in the right direction, but maybe not quite there yet, as we might expect.
I think so. And I think there's still, for me, it's still very medical driven. It's still quite medical model. There's a sense that you have to have blood pressure, you have to have daily temperature, you have to have this stuff. And it's like, well, actually, older people, sometimes their temperature runs low and it's actually the last thing to go up. The first thing you notice is they're wandering a bit more confused. And I think we just got to embrace the fact that there's a millennials type young person approach to health. So they're embracing remote access to GPs, online GP consultations, happy with an app, they'll manage, but there's still a group of people that need more. And we're really in danger of having an inequitable service whereby if you're young and savvy and you've got a good capacity to deal with all the information you're being given, you'll do all right. And then people, if you can't read or write, you are in trouble. And we have to start thinking of those things as well. And I think that's something. So wrapping services again to make those things accessible are going to be quite key.
Yeah, fantastic. I'm going to open the floor again and just see if there are any questions in relation to those topics. So we talked about the NHS and the translation into this new form. We've got lots of potential opportunities there to create technologies and to get funded through the NHS and to deploy them. Are there any questions in relation to all those themes? Just a couple more, and I think we're going to wrap up then probably by past. So any questions from the floor? Don't be shy. Yes, another one here.
Do you expect this? Catherine, do you think the consolidation of these units within the NHS will make it easier and faster for innovation to get to the right place?
Yes.
That's ultimately
yes,
the purpose.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Anything that means that and this was a bit of a surprise for me coming into this sector, that everybody is looking at the patient. So everybody will say, I'm so patient-centric or service user-centric, and I've got the patient right at the very heart of it. And I use this example that when I'm looking at this patient, they've got a barcode. And when I'm looking at this one, they called FANK. So we're all looking at the same thing, but we're looking at it in different ways. And so joining up the view of what somebody needs in a really customer-centric way. So what do I need from all of these different health and social care providers? Bringing in the voluntary sector is massively important as well. So creating these we've got a program called Thriving Communities, and it's looking at the whole ecosystem of what is available to an individual, from their local neighborhood app, to a voluntary centre, to a charitable foundation in their area. So how can we actually create the ecosystems of support that enable people to thrive? And technology's got a massive place in that, and that moves us hugely away from that medicalised model. And that's only possible when you've got joint leadership. So I'm part Surrey County Council funded, part health. We've got within our executive, we've got, I think it's 5 out of the 10 roles are jointly appointed roles. So you've got that medical and that health and social care, that social care view together. And it's only when you bring right brain, left brain together that the magic starts to, I think the magic starts to happen. And of course, talking about bringing funding together potentially. We're not bringing funding together, but we've got joint commissioning posts. So one of the things that drives me mental in places is where hospital trusts are desperately trying to discharge people back into their own homes because it's the right thing to do, and they need the beds. And then you've got local authorities, and they're both bidding for the same care home places. So you've got 2 teams of people phoning up and going, I'll give you 800 quid. And then someone will go, no, I'll give you 950. So you've got this, you can have bidding wars that are happening for really scarce care home places, which bringing that commissioning function together. So having that joint commissioning, joint pathways, really thinking about bringing community assets to play, all of that will give the right environment for innovation.
Brilliant, thank you.
When it comes to ethnic minorities, what sort of challenges and approaches and solution, do you have an example how we address them?
Yeah, so I think it's really interesting. So we're doing some work in Leicester, and we've been working on how we translate the app, and we're talking about cultural translation. So I worked in East London, so I've been drunk in Upper Street a lot. Yeah, I worked in East London, and we had a really big Bangladeshi population, and their approach to older people very different to what my growing up was. And I think so. There's a real challenge. I was sat with a guy from the HSN, and we were just sitting there, and it's just, we've got to have the staff from those cultures embedded in our teams to represent those cultures in what we're doing. And I think what we found with our technology, so I found Surrey really weird because I talked to lots of posh white people in very large houses and I'm thinking, I can't relate to this. I mean, I'm from Oldham, and in Oldham, we have quite a different mix of populations. But I think what we've got to do is work out what's culturally right. So I worked in Trafford in Manchester. We had an area of Trafford where there were no care homes because that was where our South Asian population were. And they were still living in multi-generational homes. They're now at the point where they've had to build the first care home because now things are changing. And I think what we've got to do is understand not just translation, language. It's not just about translating my app into Gujarati. That's not what it's about. It's about, does it mean something to you? So I go in work in people's homes and I'm saying, no, you need to stop preparing the meal for your mum. Your mum needs to get up and be preparing. But that's rude. That's rude. I need to prepare my... No. You're making your mum ill because she's not getting up and doing it herself. This needs to change. And that's quite a directional shift. And I've had quite a lot of those conversations. So I think it's really interesting because I think there's a sense of making things in different languages, but not actually understanding the very different cultural shift. And we did some work with a Pakistani group in Manchester, and we did frailty assessment, which picks up, we did use the Groningen Frailty Indicator, which is a self-report measure. One of the questions is, are you still affected by a bereavement 2 years later? 70% of the women in that room were affected because they hadn't been able to go home. And the bereavement was back in Pakistan and they'd not made it home, and they never got over that. And so off the back of that, the group brought in bereavement team and actually did sessions around moving on and dealing with that. I'd never seen that before in a group. And I just think it's really really interesting. And I think it's something that we need to, I think, like I say, Richard Stubbs up in Yorkshire and Humber is doing some really amazing work on that. And what he's saying is we have to have the cultural representation in our team. So we've just been talking today about how we recruit people from different cultural backgrounds into our customer services team to work, because they work with us on our pathways to make sure it makes sense. Because it's not just you can't just do, we're a global population, we need to get on with it.
Fantastic. Thank you for the questions and the answers. I'm going to, rather than do a sort of rambling summary of the session for various reasons, I'm going to just go around and give you all 30 seconds just to give us a take home. What do you want us to take away from this session? First of all, no pressure, Catherine. Tick, tick.
Health and care integration is happening. Bringing people together with multidisciplinary points of view from the very top of the ICS all the way through to service delivery is the absolute, to my mind, that's the silver bullet to help design services that are culturally and sociologically appropriate to people.
I think my take home would be that better aging doesn't mean defying aging. Better aging is about being able to do what you want to be able to do for as long as possible within what you're able to do. And I think technologies that enable people to carry on enjoying the things they enjoy are going to very, very important, and that we need to really focus on that. And I think that wearables have got a real future in this space. And I think that for me, it's really important that we consider the healthy aging, not just the diseased aging, because that's what we all aspire to.
I think probably more of a takeaway from the Giant Health event generally, rather than this particular session, but I've been surprised to see how much of an emphasis there is on machine learning and AI. And I think certainly that preventative or preemptive approach is obviously something that has advantages. We have to be careful how we do adopt AI, and we have to ensure that we ask the right questions of the data. And obviously there are a range of ethical considerations as well. But I think there are some really incredible opportunities there. And I certainly am very excited to see what happens in that space. And that's something that we're also working on with our smart socks.
Fantastic. Kashmir smart sock.
Kashmir smart socks.
Yeah. And I'll just wrap up with a view on that as well. I think so. I think what excites me, I suppose, and since finishing university many years ago, I've been completely in an innovation sort of mindset that whole time, which is very chaotic and not very sort of direct and straightforward. It kind of really relates to the NHS and to health in general and the stuff I raised earlier. And I think that's really such a great opportunity. If big companies can't work it out, I think it really does open up the opportunities for smaller organizations and people working in niche areas to kind of really do great stuff in those spaces. And I think that's really what I want, us to take away as a positive from the chaos and from the lack of simplicity from Google's point of view, and revel in it and make it happen. So thanks everyone for coming to this session. Say again.
So thanks for staying.
Oh, thanks for staying. They want more. They would be here till 5:30 if we'd let them. But you can only have this much. We'll be doing another show soon. Ticketed, isn't it? I think it's quite expensive. Yeah. Never mind. So great to see you all here. Thanks for coming. And we'll all be here next year, I assume, in the same venue. Less COVID, more Giant Health.